Good day and welcome to this online policy dialogue on circular economy for biodiversity, delivering on the benefits, organized by the European Policy Center and supported by the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra. My name is Stefan Sipka and I will be moderating this session. I'm a policy analyst at the European Policy Center. We often discuss about the benefits that circular economy can give to our economy and society, how it can make our economy more sustainable, as well as competitive and resilient. Yet, the linkages between circular economy and nature agenda are often not discussed as much. And arguably, circular economy can help a lot, given that it's about smarter use of resources, retaining the value of materials in our economy for as long as possible. It can help reduce pressures on our natural capital and also rely on nature to provide solutions with lower climate and environmental impact. This is something that we will try to shed more light on these prospects as well as challenges and the policies for the way forward in order to help align circular economy and nature agenda and support nature restoration and making our ecosystems healthier and improve our biodiversity. This discussion is very topical because, of course, we have seen due to the Russian invasion, but also because of the previous COVID crisis, how fragile our economy is, how dependent we are on obtaining valuable resources from foreign markets and often unreliable partners. We are going through the crisis, the energy crisis and inflation, and it just makes sense that we use the resources we have in a smarter way, including also natural resources. Moreover, the EU is working on introducing mandatory nature restoration targets, and there are similar developments at the UN level. Therefore, this is something that it's a topical discussion, and looking forward to actually to listening to our speakers for today and seeing what more can be done in this field. We have a number of interesting speakers to share their reflections on the matter, and then of course we will be having a Q&A session afterwards. But first, I would like to give the floor to Janez Potočnik, co-chair of the International Resource Panel and former European Commissioner for Environment, for a keynote speech. Janez, thank you for joining this discussion, and happy to hear your view on how can we align the goals, the agendas and policies for circular economy and biodiversity.
Thank you, Stefan. Dear friends, thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. You can probably guess that the theme of how circular economy can build a thriving natural world, it's very close to my heart. And reverse biodiversity loss without transforming, because, by the way, all the latest evidence clearly shows that we cannot halt and reverse biodiversity loss without transforming our consumption and production systems. And systemic circular economy solutions are among the most powerful tools for that transformation. To briefly introduce my work, together with Isabella Teixeira, I co-chair the International Resource Panel, a science policy interface hosted by UN Environment Programme. We are a group of about 35 scientists and the same number of government representatives from across the globe, including European Commission, coming together to assess the trends and impacts of natural resource use, and also to develop future scenarios and science-based solutions. In our former roles as Brazilian Minister and European Environment Commissioner, Isabella and I were actively involved in negotiating the Aichi biodiversity targets in Nagoya 2010. 20 biodiversity goals we committed to as a global community. The sad fact is that after more than a decade, more or less, they have not been in reality met. Biodiversity is being lost at an unprecedented rate. The UN Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, shorter IPBES, estimates 1 million species are at risk from extinction. over 100 times nature's background rate. And the situation will likely just get worse. Our current biodiversity actions are not, lesser focused on the root drivers of nature destruction as they should be. And natural resource use is at the forefront of these drivers. IRP data actually shows that extraction and processing of resources is responsible for more than 90% of global land-related biodiversity loss. Extraction of biomass alone accounts for 80%. And without major intervention, the situation, as mentioned before, will only get worse. Our material extraction has tripled since 1970 in the last 50 years, while global material productivity has mostly declined in the past 2 decades due to the fact that we are shifting production from resource more efficient countries like Europe, like Japan, to resource less efficient countries like, for example, Indonesia. On its current trajectory, material use, everything extracted from Earth, will double again by 2060. So it's impossible to see how we can tackle biodiversity loss without improving our natural resource management. But there is a hope. A new global deal for nature will be agreed at CBD COP15, as you know, at the end of the year. It's essential for that plan to centralize the role of circular economy in halting biodiversity loss. Citra's recent report, Tackling Root Causes Halting Biodiversity Loss through the Circular Economy, clearly shows how major interventions in our production systems can stem fundamental drivers to halt and partially also reverse biodiversity loss by 2035. Encouragingly, ambitious governments are recognizing the need for resource efficiency and circular economy strategies for climate and nature. This year's G7 Climate, Energy and Environment Communiqué committed to leveraging systemic resource efficiency and circular economy solutions in national climate and biodiversity strategies. We can see global ambition for nature starting to increase. Last year, G7 leaders committed also to the aim of halting and reversing nature loss by 2030. 93 countries from all global regions have signed the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, which also aims to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. The High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People also brings together over 70 countries aiming to lead the way in protecting land and ocean for nature. We can also see sustainable production and consumption, as well as changing how we value nature, captured in the draft CBD Global Biodiversity Framework. All good news, but these ambitions need to be accompanied by strong implementation plans leading to tangible actions. We need to start seeing results from these increased ambitions. Against this backdrop, Isabella and I wanted to ensure that the upcoming Biodiversity COP learns the lessons from Aichi and develop strong science-based implementation plans which would address the fundamental drivers of the biodiversity loss. So together we wrote a piece looking at biodiversity governance through a natural resource use lens, highlighting principles which can halt and reverse biodiversity loss and how they can be taken forward at COP15 to strengthen the next set of biodiversity targets. The principles are knowing your impact, planning together, growing with nature, and valuing nature. I will talk you through them, starting with knowing your impact on nature. We can also call this value chain transparency, showing the impacts of natural resource use at every stage of a product's life cycle, from the extraction of the materials to their end use, telling you how your consumption impacts nature. For example, is the coffee in your cup linked to deforestation? How much more resource intensive is the meat on your plate than an alternative protein, such as a plant-based burger? By knowing their impact, consumers, producers, investors, and policymakers will be able to choose sustainable, nature-positive models and scale them up at every step of the value chain. Citra's Biodiversity and Circular Economy report has clear findings here, showing that globally meat consumption needs to fall by 50% and dairy consumption by nearly 70% to halt nature loss. These reductions will be impossible without precise knowledge of where and how production is impacting nature. Progress is encouraging, but the value chain transparency to be a reality, we need strong scientific data and consistent international standards. At COP15, ambitious countries, including European Union, G7, High Ambition Coalition for Nature, can take leadership by committing to developing an agreed science-based standardized method for measuring the impact of consumption on biodiversity, acknowledging that COP15 will only be part of the journey. The next principle is planning together, balancing the needs of nature and people in the space available. Countries are missing the full picture of how their natural resources are being used. They need integrated strategies showing the spatial and resource needs of nature and people. Without an integrated strategy, conflicting methods will not be balanced. For example, where should we grow forests? Which land is better sustainable for which crops, and which land is really indispensable for urbanization? Having a strategy that integrates all future biomass and land needs means that decision makers can better conserve biodiversity and at the same time meeting, of course, human needs. We need governments to use science-based mapping of biodiversity and natural resource uses. This would enable competing demands to be met with the space available. Citra's biodiversity and circular economy modeling shows that we need to reduce urban sprawl and make space for forests and other habitats. Operationalizing this absolutely relies on world-class data-driven mapping. And we can see that this is currently seriously lacking. Only 15% of national biodiversity action plans currently contain maps to guide action. But again, there is a promising progress led by UNEP's World Conservation Monitoring Center and my colleagues at Systemic. The Spaces Coalition is bringing governments and businesses together, facilitating the use of world-class mapping data to intelligently plan for nature positivity. Investors are already starting to demand transparent data on nature impacts. So initiatives like this support future businesses as well as good outcomes for biodiversity. Building on this progress at COP15, key governments and science players could jointly commit to developing internationally agreed mapping standards based on the best possible science and to build capacity to implement inclusive spatial planning as widely as possible. This could be initiated by bringing together ambitious governments and technical and implementation experts in a standing group working towards science-based mapping standards and comprehensive user-friendly tools. The third principle is growing with nature. Production, especially food production, can be made more sustainable through harnessing nature's inherent regenerative capacity. The role of agriculture is absolutely crucial here. What does that mean? In very simple terms, it means harnessing nature-based solutions. This could be reducing chemical fertilizers and encouraging natural soil processes or generating value from natural products. This would improve resilience, and improved resilience will be essential to protect farmers against the increasing extreme weather events. Policymakers should incentivize production, which enhances nature by redirecting financial support to regenerative agriculture, to commodity production, which goes hand in hand with reforestation. Working with producers to scale this solution should be a priority. As a first step at CBD COP15, ambitious countries, again, including the G7, can commit to developing a set of science-based criteria for nature positivity, giving much needed clarity to governments, producers, and investors. And finally, let me turn to the principle of valuing nature. As mentioned earlier, economic systems have failed to recognize our dependence on nature. This failure is contributing to the mismanagement of natural resource use. Incentives need to change so that it makes economic sense not to destroy the biodiversity we all rely on. Our current system does not incentivize sustainable resource use. In fact, quite the opposite. At the moment, the signals we receive tells us that it makes most economic sense to destroy nature. Trees are only worth something when they become a timber. Even though we rely on nature for everything, and we know of the severe risk its destruction exposes us to, we do not value nature, and this is incredibly difficult to reverse, since we have become so used to not valuing it. So we desperately need to shift the economic signals which producers and consumers receive. Otherwise, we are asking citizens to behave irrationally against all the theory I was taught in economic faculty. The Dasgupta review makes the case for changing what we mean by economic success. Economic decisions could be based on an inclusive measure of wealth, factoring in human produced and natural capital. This would enable governments recognizing the importance of ecosystems in all their decisions. As a concrete step, at COP15, countries and financial institutions can commit to working together towards the establishment of a minimum standard for natural capital data. And by the way, they could also commit to shifting the tax structure from taxing mostly labor to also taxing resources. They could also collaborate for a joint capacity building initiative with countries on natural capital measurement and inclusion of nature in decision-making. To conclude, my message ahead of CBD COP15 would be to focus on strong science-based implementation, which goes beyond conserving area of biodiversity and really leads to change in our production and consumption sectors. Unless we use all our entire toolkit of measures, it will not be possible to slow and reverse the massive loss of biodiversity we are currently experiencing. It all comes back to the need to transform our unsustainable natural resource use patterns. By transforming the way we produce and consume, we can avoid most future biodiversity loss and recover the damage already done. Dear friends, humans are part of nature. Destroying nature is destroying our own future. Is this really so difficult to understand? The doors of IRP are always open for collaboration on circular solutions for climate and for nature, and I wish you a very productive dialogue.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janez, for your keynote speech and for really valuable inputs, again, stressing the importance of this topic because of the alarming rate at which we are losing our biodiversity and many species threatened with extinction, but also that more needs to be done, and for laying out this blueprint for the way forward, I would say, with this a number of topics, with a number of actions on, so trying to be more scientific and measuring the impacts of our activities on nature, and also planning, being more strategic and trying to coordinate our activities, valuing nature and using nature-based solutions to reduce our impacts on environment and nature, and also to support climate action. And indeed, more can be done, more needs to be done, and hopefully there will be progress also at COP15 in this regard. And happy to come back to some of the points that you raised. Thank you. And now I would like to also introduce our also other speakers for today. We have Team Forslund, the circular economy specialist from the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra, Emma Watkins, Senior Policy Analyst, Low Carbon and Circular Economy, Institute for European Environmental Policy, and Pavel Misiga, Head of Unit, Circular Economy and Biobased Systems, DG Research and Innovation, European Commission. Thank you for joining this event. And we will first hear key introductory remarks from you, and followed by the discussion and the Q&A. However, I would like to encourage the participants to already write your questions in the Q&A as soon as you can, so that we can try to address as many questions as possible until the end of the discussion. Over to Emma Watkins. I would be happy to hear your reflections on this topic. So, in your view, what measures are needed to interlink circular economy and nature agendas? What we really need to be mindful of, and what we need to do better and more to actually make this transition happen, and avoid, failing to reach the target that we are set, as it was the case before.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for the invitation to speak at this event. It's very interesting. And also thanks to Janez and Tim for their very interesting contributions so far. At IEP, we've also been working over the summer on a new report, which is looking at the linkages between circular economy policies at the EU level and other areas of environmental policy. One of those is biodiversity. So we have a section that's looking at biodiversity and circular economy links specifically. The report should be published hopefully in the next couple of weeks, so you can keep an eye out on our website and Twitter for that. But just to talk through a few of the kind of findings that we've had from that report. In terms of the kind of general coherence between circular economy policies and legislation and the nature agenda, it seems to be reasonable. For example, the Circular Economy Action Plan highlights the role of circular economy in reducing the negative impacts of resource extraction, which is obviously one of the key drivers for biodiversity loss. So circular economy can contribute to biodiversity restoration in that way. In terms of the European Green Deal, it also recognises the importance of preserving and restoring biodiversity in general, and again notes that some of the key drivers of biodiversity loss include changes in land use and sea use, the exploitation of natural resources, and climate change. So the drivers are very well known, the drivers of biodiversity loss, and they also link obviously to the impacts of circular economy. The biodiversity strategy itself, I believe, mentions circularity specifically in the context of the use of materials, products and services from forestry, which are key for the development of a circular bioeconomy. So that link is also made. And it highlights the reliance of industry on species and ecosystem services for their means of production. So again, the link is very clear. The biodiversity strategy also notes that buildings, agriculture and food and drink are key sectors that depend on nature for resources, and that aligns quite well with the key sectors that are identified in the Circular Economy Action Plan as areas for action. So construction and buildings and food, water and nutrients. So they're targeting very similar sectors, which is an indication that the policies are heading in a similar direction. A number of circular economy initiatives, including those announced in the Circular Economy Action Plan, refer to biodiversity in general terms. So they note, for example, in their preambles or in their kind of context sections, that biodiversity loss is a very important issue that needs to be addressed through policy, and that negative impacts need to be avoided as far as possible. And wider action on biodiversity is necessary and important. But some of the initiatives on circular economy include more specific considerations related to biodiversity, or that can have a positive impact on biodiversity. For example, in the new batteries regulation, the proposed batteries regulation, in terms of due diligence of supply chains, biodiversity is mentioned. So it's mentioned as one of the aspects that needs to be taken into consideration in terms of current and foreseeable impacts on biodiversity. So that's quite an interesting aspect. Also, there's a forthcoming communication on bio-based, biodegradable and compostable plastics that I think has the potential to take note and note the importance of the potential impacts on biodiversity of the use of biological feedstocks for plastics, but also the potential impacts of biodegradable and compostable plastics, especially if the public and citizens think that biodegradability and compostability means that you don't need to dispose of those plastics quite so carefully. So there could be kind of spillover impacts there if improper disposal starts to happen of those types of plastics. Then some other initiatives also mention the impacts of the kind of sectors that they're addressing as amplifiers of biodiversity loss. For example, the impacts of microplastics, which I think are very well known now, should be addressed in the forthcoming microplastics legislation. And also the chemical strategy obviously recognises that chemical pollution is an important factor for biodiversity loss. And I believe also through the new state aid guidelines on climate, environment and energy, there's the potential for state aid for biodiversity and ecosystem restoration and protection. So there's kind of allowance there for financial support as well. So just to conclude, I think although obviously circular economy policies have their own objectives and they're aiming towards greater circularity of production and consumption, they do also have the potential to help to address the various drivers of biodiversity loss, including pollution, resource extraction and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma, for your reflections on this and the linkages between the different policies including circular economy and biodiversity, and how is it reflected in the Green Deal and other say spin-off policies. And of course, we will discuss more about the policies that we need to actually also to ensure that this transition takes place. But also, thanks for the heads up for the upcoming study that you are finalizing. Looking forward to reading it. Then I would like to give the floor to Pavel Misiga, and building on what we also heard from other speakers, would be great if you could provide a brief overview on what the Commission is currently working on when it comes to the circular economy agenda, and also how can EU policies be used to support the linkages between the circular economy and nature agendas?
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. My name is Pavel Misiga. I'm head of the Circular Economy and Biobased Systems Unit in DG RTD, which is the department of the Commission that deals with research and innovation, and supports research and innovation activities through European Union fund and framework program for R&I. I would be happy if my colleagues from Policy DGs joined me today, because I think that the issue that we are discussing has very strong policy dimension, and we should look at our policies and how these policies actually take biodiversity and biodiversity into account and what needs to be done. What we do in our DG together with other colleagues, focusing on more on research, like JRC, we are looking, I hope I can say it a little bit more forward, but I will still in my presentation I will still touch upon policy development and where policy takes biodiversity into account. And I would like to echo very much what other speakers have already said, but I will try to focus on European dimension and take the European perspective. Let me share my screen very quickly and present few slides. Yes, so we are looking into this relationship between circular economy and biodiversity, and try to find the specific effects and mechanisms that would help us then identify circular economy solution or circular economy approaches that can be then promoted and supported. Innovative solutions can be found to accelerate these solutions to have positive impact on ecosystems and biodiversity. So on one side, we identify the main causes and drivers of ecosystem degradation, and on the other side, we try to identify the circular economy approaches where we see the biggest positive impact. And to simplify it, I would say that there are 3 circular economy approaches. I don't know whether I can call it that way, but one is the materialization of economy, so to reduce the material consumption in order to avoid the need for extraction of new materials from natural environment. Then there is the whole set of circular or R solutions, reuse, repair, etc., recycle. And the third one is use of renewable materials, basically moving towards bio-based materials and replacing materials and products based on metal, minerals, fossil fuels with bio-based materials to use the regenerative capacity of ecosystems. But as we look in this potential of the circular economy approaches, we see a lot of opportunities, but also we see some limitation and risks. And one message that I would like to send today is that it is very important how circular economy solutions are implemented or how they are designed so that they deliver real benefits. On this slide, I would like to show the schematic presentation of material flow through European economy, and we can see that the dominant flow is linear still. So out of approximately 8 gigatons of materials, and it includes minerals and fossil materials, metals, as well as biomass. Around 90% goes through economy in a linear way, so they end up as waste. They are dissipated into environment or concentrated in different forms of waste deposits. So we are only starting with circular economy, and this linear flow has to be reduced, and this is why the two approaches to reduce the flow, to reduce the absolute volume or mass of materials entering and going through the European economy, as well as increasing that loop that is on the bottom of the picture. But what is the situation? Are we really moving towards this objective? So we see very slight reduction of material use in Europe. We don't see reduction of material use globally, and we suspect that some reduction at European level actually means increase at global level. So it is very likely that the material footprint of our economy is not reducing, is not decreasing. It may be stable or even grow. Concerning the circular approaches, reuse, refurbishing, remanufacturing, recycling, etc., we are increasing these rates, but far slower than we would need for the transition. We are also asking questions whether our policies are coherent, and whether there is any risk that certain policies will actually increase material use or increase linearity in our economic systems. And we can look, for example, at the energy policy, and we all know that we need to transfer our energy system towards renewable energy, but it will have also material cost. We will need a lot of material to build the infrastructure, to build the storage, to build, for example, electric vehicles, etc. So we may see that that there are certain trade-offs between policies, and it is very important to have the policy development that takes these potential trade-offs into account. Now the question is how much of what is the potential of circular economy, and we see that it is very different for different material streams. But just as a matter of example, let's take steel or iron, and we see that more than 60% of iron is already recycled, but our economy needs more than what is possible to get from recycling. So the 60% of recycled iron represents only 30% of the need of our economy. So there is potential, and we should go that way. But we should also understand that in our economy we may still need the fresh flow of raw materials to feed the material economy, and how to make sure that this new flow will not have continued or increased impact on biodiversity. The third circular economy approach that I mentioned, I will go back to this, is moving towards bio-based materials, and there is clearly huge opportunity if we do it right, if we do it in the way that Janez described as growing with nature. But there is also risk that the needs that we have for bio-based materials, and they are increasing, and you can look at energy policy and the objectives, for example, for bio-based fuels and other needs. The question is whether what is the potential moving towards bio-based given the land available and the production techniques. So there are many scientists who have opinion that actually the current policies have conflicting objectives in that sense. So some model shows that to supply all needs for food, feed, fuel, and bio-based materials, that we simply don't have enough land, definitely in Europe, and all these demands can lead to land use change elsewhere. So we have to be very careful. And I will present this slide, which is not related to biodiversity, but this is an example of circular economy model that went terribly wrong. So this is the result of collapsing shared bicycles in China, where new products were produced, millions of bicycles that were then disposed because the scheme collapsed. So how to make sure that circular economy actually delivers on its promises, on its potential, including the potential for protecting or restoring biodiversity and being nature positive. We know that the potential is huge, but it matters how circular solutions are designed and implemented. Ecosystem restoration, biodiversity protection must be included in objectives of these solutions. And this is not always the case, including relatively recent policies. And we spoke, for example, about textiles. The only the relatively new textile strategy does not explicitly mention biodiversity or ecosystem. But there is some hope. Still, what is proposed, we see certain proposal for instruments that can take biodiversity into account. And if they are implemented in the right way, they will drive and provide incentives for the textile industry and the whole textile ecosystem, if I can call it, to move towards sustainability, including towards reduced impact on ecosystems. What is important to do in these instruments is to look at the beginning of value chains, the phase of material extractions, and to make sure that sustainability of sourcing of materials of feedstock must be an integral part of circular solution, so that it is not forgotten. And we see many circular economy actions, either by industry or even in policies, that this phase and clear criteria for sustainability of supplying primary material, that they are often missing. So it is very important that our instruments we want to apply in circular economy transition, that they have this dimension, and this is not always the case. So this should this should be improved. And I have to say that it is not a trivial thing to do it, because to define what is sustainably produced, for example, bio-based feedstock, is not that simple, because it has many aspects, and it always does not only depend on the feedstock itself, but many other parameters that are not related to the material, but how the land is managed, in what climatic, geographical conditions, etc. So there are many research activities that look into that, and how to make this instrument and different types of instruments, including information instruments or certification and etc. How to make them operational, how to make them effective, so that they take this into account. But we are not yet there. Quite a lot of work is needed, and I think that Janez mentioned it when he speak about the need for development of standards, etc. And science and research is still needed to develop these instruments. But we have to hurry up, and we have to make sure that in the circular economy transition, this dimension is strong, is present and strong. So thank you very much. And back to you, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Pavel, for this very interesting overview on the existing and potential linkages, and also stressing the importance of implementation. I think it really deserves to be underlined, because indeed it's also about designing policies so that they actually contribute to the transition, and avoiding the potential negative side effects. Even when we have good intentions and trying to move to circular economy, we need to be careful how we design the system, but also that we implement it, even when the policies are set in the right direction, that they can be implemented. I would also say this mostly to just also think about simply also about law enforcement as such in the EU, but also trying to make these linkages at the international level. Thank you for this, Pavel. And we have a number of questions already from our participants. I will try to focus on some of them and direct them to specific speakers. And Pavel, maybe we can just already I come back to you when it comes to some of them. There was a question. There were basically two questions that are very similar, I think, on the role of industry and companies, what they can actually do, what they can prioritize, basically, when it comes to the transition to a circular economy, and also supporting biodiversity. Like, basically, the question is about what are the key important thing. Of course, it's easier said than done. There are lots of things depending on the sector, but if there is any key message that you could convey also from the policymakers' perspective and encourage them to look into different solutions? Is there anything you could already suggest?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this question. It's a great question, and I would go back to what Janez said. In fact, he started his presentation with calling for understanding the impact. So industry could start with analyzing where the impact is and where there is potential for improvement. And in this analysis, what is important for biodiversity, that they don't forget about sourcing of their materials they use, what impact it has in the first stage of life cycle. This is very often forgotten by industry. They look at how they can design the product, how they can make it recyclable, etc. But how it was sourced and was there impact on biodiversity, this is not always integrated in this. So we have also instruments, life cycle assessment methods, that is very good for many purposes, but doesn't have strong component on impact on biodiversity. So this must be part of this analysis. And then when this analysis shows where there is impact, so this impact should be addressed. And I will give you an example, if I may, how policy can facilitate this or incentivize industry to do that. For example, in one RNI instrument that we manage in the Commission, which is the Circular Biobased Euro Partnership, it's a 2 billion partnership with industry. We require that all feedstock, bio-based feedstock, is analyzed, and it is ensured that it is sourced in sustainable way. So there is no significant impact on biodiversity. So this is a requirement for applicants to demonstrate this. And I think that this could be used more broadly in different instruments, but also industry can do this by itself to analyze their impact and take an action to reduce that impact. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think it's very useful, very valuable response for this. And of course, I will have the same question for other speakers. And Janez already raised his hand. Happy to come back to you. But just before that, Pavel, I had one more question I wanted to ask immediately. There was a question on the deforestation law. I don't know if you have worked more closely on that file or not, but basically the question was like, how does it link to biodiversity laws, because it's linked only to forests? So then maybe it's just more like to clarify in a way how this legislation fits into these efforts, if you have anything to say on this.
I am afraid that I don't know enough about this particular piece of legislation. Maybe other speakers may be more familiar, but intuitively I would say that deforestation is such important. It's complete destruction of forest ecosystems. So I would say that if we avoid, if this practice is is still kind of is still existing in Europe, that I guess that it is more related to the international level. So I will stop here. No, I cannot answer this question, and I hope that colleagues will be able to answer.
No, thanks. It's just wanted to check, and indeed, I think it's more like to clarify indeed that this is linked to biodiversity, even if it's one particular is focused on forests themselves, that can have a positive spillover on ecosystems, and there are also other legislations to cover for the entire biodiversity agenda. So in that sense, it's not to be. There is a focus, but it's linked to other to the biodiversity, I would say. But yeah, thank you so much for your answers, Pavel. And yes, Janez, I wanted to come back to you. I think you have an immediate response also to what was said, and happy to hear from you.
Yeah, it's a bit unpleasant response, to be honest. I will try to develop the thinking and you will understand very well. So one thing which we all see sitting here around the table is that after a decade of quite serious efforts, which we have done on many fields, including in the industry, the situation is not getting better. So the messages which we hear from politicians, it's more or less urgency. It's now even more urgently urgent. But my dear friends, this will not change the situation if we repeat the message of the urgency. So fundamentally, what we have to start thinking is how to revert the overall logic, which is very much based on that there are people in service of the economy into there is economy in service of people. So if I translate that to economic terms, it's not about maximizing products from the sectors, it's about maximizing the needs, the meeting human needs. And that is not exactly the same thing. So humans, for example, need mobility. We don't need cars. And if you maximize mobility, the answers are totally different if you look through the sectorial logic. And sometimes the answers are not very comfortable, but unfortunately, we can't avoid that. The core problem pretty much lies in the fact, which we have all mentioned today, that market signals which we are sending to consumers and producers are simply sending us in the wrong direction. And if you send with market signals producers in a direction and consumers behave non-responsibly, which we are, by the way, doing. So how can you expect, from example, from a consumer to behave responsibly? And that's what we are asking practically in all our talks which we have, if at the same time he or she has to pay more for the house, more for the car, more for the food, more for everything if it's environmentally friendly. So it's upside down logic, which is there on the market. And then Pavel and the colleagues are setting regulation, which are trying to remedy that. But what we create, it's a confusion on the market, a lot of lobbying, which goes in different direction than actually the responsibility of overall thing. So when we analyze those things, we basically found that in all global and also national efforts, we are more or less focusing on cleaning the supply side and not really asking the difficult question, who is actually consuming the goods which we are producing. So if you, for example, focus only on the supply side, let me give you an example of steel production. You clean the steel production, which is absolutely necessary. You do some CCS and so on to capture the CO2, which might also be necessary, even if it's not most welcome solution. But have we ever asked in our talks how much of that steel is used in totally underutilized cars? How much of that steel is used in empty houses? How much of that steel is used in not fully used equipment and so on? And how are our cities designed? Are they designed to really limit the need for mobility, to limit the need for cars, to limit the need for steel, and to limit the need for energy and the need for materials? So we have to revert the logic. And by the way, if we don't start thinking in that way, in all international talks, we will have problems because we don't put on the table really the overconsumption part of the riddle, which is, of course, the riddle which in first place has to be solved by the high-income countries. And while we have in the past consumed more than the others, also the benefits went to us. Today, we are too many times hearing, yeah, this might hamper our competitiveness. We have our responsibility to lead the way to a more sustainable and circular world. Waiting for anybody else and pointing with the finger, the others don't do it, will not do the trick. That's unfortunately how it is. If you remember, the Glasgow breakthrough in the transport was that each person, everybody in all the regions, in all parts of the world would have access and that it would be cheap to the electric car. My God, if this would happen, we are doomed, because because actually it's not that. We need to provide mobility to people, not electric car with all the problems of materials which are behind, and we all know them. So looking through the CO2 solutions and disregarding other solutions, it's simply not the right way to go. And we have to combine the things. If I just give you one example, and I will finish with that, which is very nicely explaining you the human needs philosophy. Ask yourself how much of the clothes you have knit in last 2 years during the COVID comparing to the 2 years before. Because you have actually used the clothes in the context of your human need and not imposed human needs. So I have to look differently each day. I have to be in dress because this is required by the society and so on. So these are the questions which we have, and that is not making me less comfortable. On the contrary, if it would make me less comfortable, I would, the last 2 years during COVID, then wear a jacket in front of the computer and also in my house because it's making me more comfortable, but it's not making me more comfortable. So, you know, my answer to those was summarized in one sentence. If you want to limit or avoid the extinction of elephants in nature, which is our biodiversity goal, then we have to extinct in the first place elephants in our rooms. And these are the elephants we have to deal with about.
Thank you so much, Janez, for this reflection, also building on what Pavel was saying, and indeed that I mean, I would say also coming back to the question we had, that I guess companies can, depending on the sector and the industry, there is a space for them to contribute to this transition, but indeed it's easier said than done if we don't look at the bigger picture, the policies, the pricing mechanisms, and the goals, policy and societal goals that we wish to achieve. We can then, to my understanding, steer also the market and the businesses to provide solutions that then serve this, that can be supportive of also of biodiversity and other sustainability goals. I mean, arguably not that nothing can be done already, but more can be done, and there could be a clearer path if there is more, I guess, more concrete action at the policy level, right? And Janez, also I wanted to also ask you, there was a question from Golin Karina Christiansen, which is trying to, basically, it's the question is about the species that are most threatened, especially in the EU, and which are already lost, and what is the reason. But I would like to just make it more general. Is it possible? To what extent is it possible? The same way how we are prioritizing certain sectors, for example, where we can make advancements in terms of make progress in terms of circular economy, like agri-food, as mentioned by Tim. Is it possible to prioritize certain sectors, let's say, within nature and biodiversity, be it in the EU or globally, I would say, that we really need to prioritize, to focus on, and then we look at different economic sectors, how can they play a role, and different sectors for circular economy to play a role. Is this, to what extent is this possible? Is it significant? And yeah, anything that you can say on this.
Yeah. First, Stefan, when you say sector, you are immediately on the wrong way. But by the way, the next IRP report, which will be released 24, will all talk about functionalities. So meeting the functions, and functionalities include sectors, and you can translate it. But if I go to your concrete question, which you asked, of course, if you would follow the IRP science, when it comes to biodiversity loss, it's pretty straightforward. So it's connected to the predominantly with the biomass. And if it's connected to the biomass, then you have to ask yourself which sectors are mostly dealing with the biomass. And here you come close to agriculture, to forestry, to ocean management, and that's where you are. And that is not so difficult answer. And of course, these are providing the answers. It's then focusing exactly on those sectors and so on. But since we are talking about the circular economy, an argument which I have heard even from the scientific community is that decoupling is not possible because it has never been done in the past. And the past is basically telling us this is decoupling of of well-being or economic growth from the use of resources and from environmental impacts. So, but my answer to that would be very simple. If I will sit in this chair and look to the doors and wonder and want to go out in the nature, but not try to open that doors, my sitting in this chair would easily bring me to the conclusion, I cannot enter the nature because I cannot exit the doors. But we have never really tried it. And Pavel was very clear about that, how much we have really tried when it comes. So I remember that we started seriously with materially related policies, and in a quite limited way, only a decade ago. So the circular economy, as you know, it's on the table from mid of the previous decade. And it's becoming only currently one of the trends which people are talking about. So don't expect miracles in a year or two. It's about the system change, logic change, and all those things, unfortunately, do not happen fast. And the major problem in many of those things, and if we are coming back to economic signals, is that we humans got used not to pay for the things. You know, we got used to not to pay, and we don't. If somebody would actually ask us to pay for the destruction of that, and that, which would mean that we have to pay more, we would refuse. And you see many of the good policy moves which are simply stopped because it's socially unacceptable. And that is leading you to a simple conclusion that environmental transition is impossible without dealing also with equity and social questions.
Thank you so much, Janez, for these additional reflections. For Tim, there is also one specific question coming back to your study. So Ranjan Prakash Shredska is asking basically if you can share a bit more about, say something more about the methodology and the sources concerning the study, and also basically how it links with international level and supporting also countries, let's say lower income countries. And I think this is to some extent linked with also what you were saying about the importance of agri-food sector, circular economy, and biodiversity, and if there are any interesting messages that can be useful in that sense, how this can also be linked to the international level and supporting these countries, where of course there could be also questions in terms of nutrition, and yeah, if there are any linkages that you can see based on your study, but especially if you can say something more about the methodology and the sources that you used for the research.
Sure, thank you. That is quite a broad question, but I will try and say a few things about it. So we have used a model called MAGPIE, which is a land use model. So we see, for instance, if you use X amount of a resource that uses X amount of land, and it uses a dynamic equilibrium. So depending on where production would most likely take place, it then allocates in which area production would happen. And if you shift, for instance, use more of a resource, where will it shift to next to the second cheapest place, so to speak. So it is dynamic in that way. And we source data also from Predicts, from the Natural History Museum in the UK, and that is only really a sort of subset of species that we can cover. So it's not looking at the millions and millions of species that we can look at. So it is a subset of those species that we're confined to looking at, and we're also looking at there are other drivers of biodiversity loss that we don't necessarily capture, such as from pollution. So that will have biodiversity impacts in waterways. So it impacts how we use water. There's also the role of invasive species that we don't look at. So we need more research, and we also just need better data sets for that we and there are other sectors as well we need more research to look into. So we have established quite well the role of biomass. That's a big one, but in years to come, we know that the expansion of electric vehicles, renewable energy, and ICT infrastructure, that is going to use a lot more minerals. So although it's not currently using a lot of land, in the future, it's going to be a bigger driver of biodiversity loss. And also, if you think of climate change, that's going to be a bigger driver of biodiversity loss in the years to come. So we need to understand this is a temporal phenomenon that we can't look just at today and say, yes, these are the biggest drivers. We also need to look into the future. To your question on with different impacts in different regions and if there's a need for the EU to, well, sort of compensate for that, I think one thing we say is that we have, by using less resources, we reduce the production, we reduce the land, so we leave room for nature to thrive. So here we capture an opportunity that we can reach our biodiversity goals, but it doesn't happen automatically. We also need conservation and restoration efforts. And unless, if these are detached from social systems, the risk is that, well, you just shift production to some other crops, or you'd, so there would likely be a need also to support this at a local level, unless we want there would just be a shift to another way of producing into another area. So I think there's definitely a need to well, payments for ecosystem services need to go hand in hand, and unfortunately we don't look at that in this particular study, but it's a very important topic you raise.
Thank you very much, Tim, for also elaborating more upon the study, and of course, and indeed, this is something that additional research can also help answer some of the questions or go more in depth in that sense. Also, I wanted just, if you have any quick reaction on the question on the role of businesses and industries. You identified already the agri-food sector, and also we discussed, as mentioned by Janez Potočnik, that you can't, I guess you can't, ideally you would have all the policies in place that can provide proper signals for businesses to contribute to circular economy and biodiversity. But when we look at already what can be done now at the micro level within, based also on your research, is there something more that your study suggests, or that where certain companies or businesses can focus on? And of course, you can prioritize on certain sectors like agri-food, for example. But yeah, anything you can wish to say on this?
It's a good question. I think the good news here is that we have a lot of the solutions in front of us. There are many, it's like a couple of questions asked about examples as well, and I think there are good practices of reusing building material from wood construction, for instance. There's a company, Natura & Co. in Brazil, so they have found a way to get more value from a standing forest, which to me is essentially a very circular thing. If you can get more value from what you have, so rather than making broomsticks from trees, they can make well, for what do you call it, the not pharmaceuticals, but well, cosmetics from the Ucuba seeds from that tree. So you can find ways of doing that. And I think also well, what Janez Potočnik mentioned as well, like this is we need to think bigger about this, and we need to bring different solutions together. Looking at material innovation, there's a risk if we just use more and more biomass and we don't reserve that for high value use. We will just shift the problem elsewhere. But there, I think, again, the good news is that we have a lot of solutions. It's not necessarily do we use this material or that material. It's also about business model innovation. For instance, there's a Finnish company, Lindström, that has offered workwear as a service for well, about 100 years. So it's not, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we need to bring the good solutions and scale them across other applications. And with ICT, we can also track and optimize the repair, refurbishment, and cleaning of different materials and products. So I think we have a lot of different approaches ahead, well, right in front of us, and we need to direct those to the solutions to tackle both climate change and biodiversity loss. And I think one question here asked about which are the biggest species that are affected, and I think it really depends. Today, if you look at in Scandinavia, we know that it's largely from pastures that are falling out of use and are being turned back to forests and in forest environments. But so it's really about how we use the land today is really the biggest driver of biodiversity loss by far. But by the end of the century, it is likely to be climate change. So we need to respond to that and really find the solutions that tackle both biodiversity loss and climate change. Otherwise, it's going to hit us back when we try to solve biodiversity solutions in the future. And there again, the good news is that when we look at biomass and food in particular, that really is at the center of these solutions. And we have many good solutions from a circular economy to tackle how we can get to a more circular bioeconomy and how we can reduce waste and design new food products and regenerate the areas of production. So here, the circular economy is very important. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim, also for mentioning these possible solutions and the role of our businesses, but also stressing the importance of not only linking different topics are between circular economy and biodiversity, but also that indeed we can't separate it from other agendas, notably climate action. So it's very much interconnected, and we need to look at it as such also, I would say. Thank you. And we have a number of hands risen, and happy to hear your responses. But Emma, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. I think just to go back to the point on what businesses and industry can do, I think there's perhaps still some potential that hasn't yet been kind of fully tapped in industrial symbiosis. So the use of, whenever products are produced, there are byproducts or wastes that are produced that could potentially be of use in other industrial processes or other production by other companies or by other industries. So I think that's also an avenue that's kind of worth exploring in a bit more detail. I know that the Circular Economy Action Plan kind of announced the launch of an industry-led initiative on industrial symbiosis, which I think is kind of underway already, the Circular initiative, if I understand correctly, which is also looking at kind of creating methodologies to measure and report on industrial symbiosis and kind of identify what the co-benefits are of that. So I think that's something where there's probably still some potential that can be kind of used to greater impact.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. And also maybe just to use this opportunity, there was a question on and particularly on the Waste Framework Directive, and to what extent can it be further improved, bearing in mind the topics that we discussed. And also any ways in which you can see how we can improve the monitoring when it comes to the circular economy, monitoring the regulations or the policies from your perspective, what more can be done in this regard on these topics?
I mean, as other speakers have said, I think it's just very important to have a strong base in science for policies. So for monitoring, you need your baseline, you need to understand the current situation and what you want to achieve. Make sure that you have the right indicators in place and the right monitoring, and that's kind of implemented properly. In terms of the waste hierarchy, I think that EU circular economy policy is getting much better at moving actions higher up the waste hierarchy. So it's looking much more than it used to at repair, reuse, remanufacturing, those kinds of aspects. But I think there's still a gap in action in terms of prevention and reduction of consumption and material consumption reduction. So I think they're probably the areas to focus on more in the future.
Thank you, Emma. And Pavel?
Yes, I will support actually what Emma said, and I can use some examples and figures, in fact. So if we concluded that perhaps the direct and major impact comes from sector of agriculture, forestry, fishery, etc., we look at the flow of biomass through European economy, we see that about 2.4, 2.5 gigatons of biomass are produced. Part of that is imported, but 1/4 of that amount is wasted in Europe. And we estimated about half of this, what is currently waste, can be used with the current technologies in economic terms. So about 300 million ton of biomass should not end up in as a waste, but could be reused in biorefineries and for other reasons. So this would be already a significant contribution. What is the problem? We don't see fast enough uptake, and there are many reasons for that. We would need another seminar to discuss. But I will give you just one example. Our colleagues in JRC, they analyzed 3 bio-based waste streams from agriculture production as byproducts or waste from food, just 4 agriculture commodities. The volume in Europe is about 30 megatons per year, and this waste stream would be enough for 200 biorefineries. And they calculated, they used kind of economic conditions and assessed the economic viability. These 200 biorefineries would be completely economically viable, and yet they are not. They are not there. The investment is not done because there are many reasons, a lot of inertia, some market factors, risk awareness, etc. So this is what I say. We have to accelerate. We need to provide stimuli. We need to provide incentives that these obvious kind of low-hanging fruit solutions are at least used, so that we at least reduce the pressure on the natural environment. And this is also linked to the waste directive. So we need we need to implement. There are still implementation gaps on plastics there. Last week I discussed it with ERV experts because we asked them to provide capital actually to help to build infrastructure that is needed to use the waste. So there is still, just to meet the legislative requirements, we need capacity for processing of 10 megatons of plastic waste. Not speaking about what is the full potential of circular solution there. So yeah, there are ways. There is still easy to do, easy to implement solutions. We need to push for that and provide those stimuli, provide incentives so that economic actors exploit these opportunities.
Thank you, Pavel, indeed for highlighting that their solutions are already there, but indeed we need some additional support, including also like investments and policies to help make these solutions actually come true, to actually implement them, because they are there, and it's a shame not to use the most of it. Thank you. And Janez, happy to hear from you.
You're muted.
Yes, you're muted.
Thanks. Very quickly, since I know we have to finish. You know that at least at the beginning, from the civil society, most of the attention for COP15 and CBD was on 30% target on conservation. Why is this call legitimate? It's legitimate predominantly from one point, because they don't trust that the rest of 70% we will fix it. And at the end, we would, of course, need to talk about how we settle the 100% that we will not lose the biodiversity. Second point, which I would like to say, all individual efforts of the companies are, of course, useful. So don't misunderstand me that I underestimate the importance of that. But we tried the shortcuts already some decades ago, but the shortcuts are unfortunately not existing. And if I repeat myself and later Emma, so understanding for what you need good data, good science, measurement, standards, measures, policy, other policy measures, monitoring. So back to the basics. Unfortunately, that's where we are. Because if we don't go from there, we will simply not build a house on solid ground. And we need to start building the house on solid ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janez, for for these reflections. And indeed, I think we could continue the discussion if we had more time, because I think it's a very important as well as interesting topics and lots of things that I would be happy to ask you. But I think for today, at least, I think we're coming to an end of this discussion. And I think really we shed some light on this topic and looking into how circular economy can support biodiversity. And indeed, as our speakers mentioned, we need to also start with developing proper metrics, looking at the whole, looking at it holistically, beyond just nature protection and trying to restore nature, also by looking into different parts of our economy, how we produce, how we consume. Policies can will play a crucial role to provide the proper signals to businesses, but also consumers to be part of this transition. And of course, this transition needs to happen at the global level. We of course need to look at which parts of the economy are where there are possibilities, for example, with circular economy. In that sense, we need to look at the details, but also keeping the bigger picture in mind in this regard. And yeah, so I think it's definitely a lot can be done, but more needs to be done, because as already mentioned by our speakers, we are losing our biodiversity at an alarming rate, and we are exploiting the natural resources beyond their natural capacity, and indeed this needs to stop. So I would like to thank our speakers for a very interesting discussion, very valuable reflections, and also to thank to the participants for their attention and your active participation in this discussion. And of course, looking forward to having you at our future discussions and discussing these topics again in the future. So thank you once again, and wish you a nice day.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.